Let me just close my doors so my dog doesn't come in and jump on me. Just trying to give you a little sample of what a beginning of a class might be like here at Williams. And I really encourage, whenever I'm in class, I encourage active participation. It's very hard to do it in the same way virtually, but please do through the chat or virtually raise your hand, and then your face should pop up on my screen so I can answer questions. And I'll try to end early enough so that there'll be time for some Q&A at the end as well. So psychology. I don't know how many of you have had a psychology class already. Maybe you can indicate so in the chat. But when people think of psychology, they typically think of clinical psychology, which deals with psychological disorders, with mental health more generally. And that's not what I do, and that's not what this class is going to be about. But in our psych department, we do have several people who specialize in clinical psychology. They study things like depression or post-traumatic stress, eating disorders, schizophrenia, things like that. So you can take classes that cover those issues and do research on that kind of thing. But there's also several other major areas of psychology that our department represents that you might not think of when you think of psychology. So neuroscience is an area that's really at the intersection of psychology and biology. And if you concentrate in neuroscience, in Williams, for example, about half the faculty are in the psych department, half are in biology, but they really work together. In psychology, it's really looking at the intersection of brain and behavior. So there are faculty who study things like addiction, or the effects of concussions on behavior and mental health, on the power of sleep, all kinds of things having to do with brain and behavior. Another area of psychology that we have at Williams is called cognitive psychology. It's really about mental processes, thinking, decision-making, things like that. So you might take a course or do research on the issue of what's the best way to study in order to remember the material. So we have faculty who specialize in that kind of thing. Developmental psychology is about how we develop, how we change over the lifespan. A lot of developmental psychologists focus on babies, and students take the class because they love looking at videos and pictures of babies. So we have research on how babies form attachment with caregivers, for example. How one of our faculty members in the department studies how children learn through gesture, like if you're trying to learn math and if a teacher does a lot of nonverbal gestures with their hands, does that help? And actually does help children learn different math concepts, for example. So how does that work? I don't study any of these issues. What I am is a social psychologist, and that's what we're going to focus on today. So what is social psychology? I define it as a scientific study of how individuals think, feel, and behave in a social context. So we study things like working or playing in groups, group dynamics. And I'm sure if you get assigned a group project in class, a lot of you are like, oh no, not another group project, because I know how hard it is for the group to coordinate so that it's not only one person doing all the work. What are the factors that make those kind of groups work better or worse? That's the kind of stuff that social psychologists study. It's why we can get paid as consultants with teams, for example. How do you get a team of players to work together as a group to be their best possible selves? We study things like social influence, attraction, why and how and when we help each other or hurt each other, prejudice and discrimination. Some of you may have heard of this subfield called behavioral economics. That's really social and cognitive psychology applied to economic decision making. So I want to show you a clip that really illustrates this definition of how individuals think, feel, and behave in a social context. So I hope this works. This is from a very old TV show, one of the first unscripted shows when that was a new thing in the early 60s. So let's just watch this together.
The gentleman in the elevator now is a candid star. These folks who are entering, the man with the white shirt, the lady with the trench coat, and subsequently one other member of our staff, will face the rear. And you'll see how this man in the trench coat tries to maintain his individuality, but little by little, he looks at his watch, but he's really making an excuse for turning just a little bit more to the wall. Now we'll try it once again. Here's the candid subject. This man has apparently been in groups before. Here's a fella with his hat on in the elevator. First he makes a full turn to the rear and Charlie closes the door. A moment later, we'll open the door, everybody's changed positions. Now we'll see if we can use group pressure for some good. Now, in a moment, on Charlie's signal, everybody turns forward. Notice they take off their hats. Now, do you think we could reverse the procedure? Watch.
Oh, I realize I'm supposed to record this. Courtney, I don't know if you started to or if I need to, but if you can't, let me know. And I'll do it and get out of the slideshow to set that up. But otherwise, I'm assuming you can do it.
Yes.
So anyway, why do people behave that way? Why, as everyone was turning to the side or to the rear, did the individual do so quickly and automatically? It's really an illustration of a concept we call conformity, which you're all, of course, familiar with. The definition I would give for conformity is it's a tendency to change our perceptions, opinions, or behavior in ways that are consistent with group norms. So usually it's perfectly normal and rational. In this case, it was a ridiculous example of a group norm where for some reason people are turning in these weird ways. And it's very difficult for most of us to deviate. Even if we think it's weird to be the person doing something different from everybody else, even if what everyone else is doing is weird to us. So it's just easier just to get along and go with the group norm. Conformity really has good, bad, and terrible connotations. We mostly think of the bad, but really without conformity, civilization would not be possible. We'd be driving wherever we wanted, independent of rules of the law. People would just do whatever they want, independent of anybody else's concerns. So in order for civilization to exist, in order for a group to get along at all, there's got to be a fair amount of conformity. But of course, there's a lot of bad to it when people do the wrong things, peer pressure, things like that. When people do stuff they know is dangerous or wrong or immoral, but they do it because other people are doing it. And the ugly, the worst of humanity, genocide, war, things of that sort, could only be possible by massive amounts of people all doing the collective wrong thing. Again, deviating from a norm can be really, really devastating. Even in our culture, which is often considered very individualistic. It's about the rights of an individual. In other cultures, it's more about collectivists, where it's about group harmony. The United States is sort of a paragon of individualism. And yet, even within the United States, for those of us who are from this culture, conformity is a very prevalent and important thing. Deviating from everyone else could feel devastating. It could be just in your own mind. No one else really cares, but you feel so awkward to do it. And often, of course, in reality, where bullying, where aggression, things like that can happen for people who deviate from the norm. Even people who pride themselves on being anti-conformists. I don't go along with groups. That's my thing, is to not go along with society. Typically, they form subgroups where there's massive amounts of conformity within the sub-alternative group. So you see like punks or whatever you want to call this sort of subculture. They often have a very specific uniform where there's even more conformity within those groups than there is in the greater society, but they're deviating from the general norm of society, but still they're conforming because it's very rare for anyone to be a true individual who doesn't go along with any kind of norms, or hipsters, or whatever the group may be. Groups often quickly develop norms being what do most people in the group do, what's considered the right way to behave in this particular context. And it could sometimes be tricky when you move from one group to another where the norms are different. Your behavior in high school might be very different from how you're supposed to behave in college, and you'll be experiencing that in the not too distant future, perhaps. The behavior, what's acceptable in the locker room, may be very different from what's acceptable in the classroom, and what's considered acceptable in the boardroom at a corporate level. And when people take the same norms they use in the locker room to these other contexts, they can get into lots of trouble, of course. Now, some of the earliest research in social psychology, when it was first developing as a field, studied this kind of issue. Someone named Muzafer Sharif in the 1930s did some really interesting studies just to show how automatic it is for people in a group context to figure out what the norm is and to go along with it. So imagine that you're in a pitch black room. You can't see your hand in front of your face. It's totally pitch black. The only thing you could see off in the distance is one dot of light. After some number of seconds or a minute or two, that dot of light will start to move a little bit. It's actually automatic because your eye is going to move a little bit after some period of time, but you have no frame of reference because it's pitch black. So the dot of light will appear to move. And what Sharif took advantage of is an incredibly ambiguous situation. Like, how much did that dot of light move? For every individual, it's a little bit different because it depends on how much their own eye and head is moving. So what Sharif did is he had individuals, before becoming part of a group, just estimate how far did that dot of light move. So you see here, the first subject said, when they were asked this, they said, I think it moved 10 inches. Another subject alone in a dark room was asked, how much did that dot of light move? And they said 8 inches. A third in his own room, pitch black, said, I think it moved 2 inches. So you can see there's some diversity of opinion about how far that dot of light moved because it's ambiguous. There is no one right answer. Then he had these three individuals be in a room together, taking turns estimating how far the dot of light moved, so they can hear each other's estimates. First subject says 10 inches, second subject says 8 inches. Now the third subject is the anomaly here because they only thought it moved 2 inches. So immediately they start to move up. Well, I guess it wasn't that little, it wasn't 2, so I'll say 4. Now, there's no reason for them to have to conform. This isn't a jury. The experiment didn't say you have to form consensus. Immediately, they start to converge, and they do it a second time, and the people who had the highest estimate start going lower, the person who had the lowest estimate starts going higher, and by the third trial, they're all seeing the exact same thing. And Sharif found this in group after group after group, this convergence toward one norm. Even though there was absolutely no need to. These people didn't know each other, they didn't have to get along, they weren't going to be working together afterwards. It's that automatic to start to see this reality in the same way based on what everybody else was thinking. So what's behind this? If this were a real class, I'd have you write this down, but don't now. There's a few different sources of influence. One we can call informational. This is influence that produces conformity because a person believes others are correct in their judgments. That's, I think, what was happening in this Sharif study. People had no idea how far that dot of light moved because it was incredibly ambiguous. So they're listening to other people. If I thought it was 2, but everyone else is saying 10 or 8, it's probably more than 2. So I'm going to sort of use their judgments to give me some reality check. It's a very rational process. But sometimes social influence is more because of normative reasons. This is influence that produces conformity because a person fears the negative social consequences of appearing deviant. Here, you know the right answer. You know what you should do. But everyone else is doing something else. And I don't want to be the one person on his or her own, on their own. So I will go along with what everyone else is doing, even though I'm not really comfortable with it. I'm not sure that they're right. So here's an example of another early classic in social psychology that illustrates more the second point. Someone named Solomon Asch did a series of studies in the 50s where you had people see a card that looked like this. Here's a standard line, and here's 3 other lines. And the subject's job is to say which of these 3 lines best matches this line. And they go around and take turns and give an answer. And it was incredibly easy and obvious. So it seemed like a really boring experiment. So if you have a group of 6 or 7 subjects, each one would give the obviously right answer and say A. A is clearly the most similar to the standard line. I'm just kidding, seeing if you're paying attention. I have no idea if you are because I can't see anybody right now. The obvious right answer is C. So this is what the setup would look like. Here's Solomon Ash. Here's a group of subjects from the 50s. This is how they dressed back then. And they all go around taking turns, and they all give the obviously right answer, and it goes along. And then he puts up another card. It's also easy. And they do this for several trials. And then he puts up another card. Again, it's obvious what the right answer is. But in this case, first subject goes and gives a wrong answer. And let's say you're the subject, and you think, what's wrong with this person? They're an idiot. Maybe they've had a seizure. Something weird is going on. But you don't think too much of it. You think there's something wrong with this person. Then the second person says the same wrong answer. Let's say it's A, and you know it's B. And you're this guy. So you know your turn's coming. What do? This person says A. This person says A. There's this famous picture of this experiment. It's in like every social psychology textbook because it so greatly illustrates someone's mind being blown. Here's the guy. Here's a real subject. It's like, what is going on? Everyone else is what they call a Confederate. They're part of the act. They're accomplices, assistants of the experimenter. Everyone gives the wrong answer. What do you do if you're this guy? And it turns out a lot of the time subjects give the right answer still. They're not going to go along. But about half or maybe slightly more than half of the time, people give the wrong answer because it's too hard to constantly be the one person who deviates. So even when it's crystal clear it's wrong, you go along because it's just too awkward to be the independent person by yourself. All right, so those two examples from the early days of social psychology when people dress like this. What about today? So more recently, I and some of my Williams students designed some studies with Williams students as the participants, as the subjects in the experiment, to look at this kind of process. We had them watch an old presidential debate from way before they were born, so their own ideas about these people would not be biased anything, between Ronald Reagan and Walter Mondale. This was from the 80s, the mid-1980s, way before these subjects were around. These students were around, and we had them watch the debate. In what we call a control condition, the students just watched the debate. We didn't do anything. We didn't edit anything. They watched in groups of about 20. So we didn't edit the tape, the video of the debate. Nothing changed. They just watched the debate just as people did at the time in the 80s. Others, however, saw the same debate, except we cut the audience reaction from 2 moments in the debate where Reagan told us sort of a one-liner, kind of a joke, that got a huge reaction, huge positive reaction. People laughed and applauded, thought Reagan really won the point. And it became a really big moment in the news that night. Everyone kept replaying these great, funny lines that Reagan got off. And at the time, people thought that was what might have won the election for Reagan against Mondale, because it was such a powerful moment where he just got the crowd. So what we did is, for some number of the Williams students, they watched this debate, but we left in what Reagan said, but we took out the audience reaction. They couldn't hear the laughter, they couldn't hear applause. They just went right to the next question and answer. So it's the exact same content in this condition as in this condition, right? These two conditions were exactly the same content. The only thing that was different is we deleted the reaction to the content. We deleted the audience reaction, the audience who were watching the debate at the moment live in the studio. Okay, so everyone saw the same debate. In one condition, the control condition, we didn't edit anything. In the cut reaction condition, we just took out the audience reaction. So what did we find? This is how the percentage of students who thought one or the other or neither won the debate that night. The large majority, about 60% of Williams students, thought Reagan clearly won the debate, which is sort of how it was that night back in the 80s for real. Only about, 13, 14% thought Mondale won, and the rest thought it was kind of a tie. That's in the condition where we didn't edit anything out. Well, what happens if we just took out the audience reaction? Now you see a completely different story. Now very few Williams students thought Reagan won. A large majority thought Mondale won, over 70%. What happened between these two conditions? Reagan and Mondale said the exact same things in both conditions. The only thing that was different is this validation of the audience was removed. So Reagan's joke no longer seemed funny. It seemed maybe inappropriate even. Like, why is he trying to tell a joke that's not funny during a really important presidential debate? So it's not the content that mattered. It's the social validation or lack of validation that really seemed to carry the day. So it's an illustration of how much we take our cues of reality, our judgments of what's good and bad, based in part on other people. And in this case, the other people weren't even in the room with the students. They were audio of a room 30 years before, 50 years before, whatever it was. Okay. I imagine there might be questions to this, so I'll take them at the end. Just have a few more minutes to go. Um, a lot of social psychology research has looked at norms in the context of things like drinking and smoking. Students tend to overestimate the prevalence of many undesirable behaviors, such as alcohol use among peers. And this actually, these perceptions matter a lot in terms of students' own behavior. You may think everyone else is drinking more, or smoking more, or vaping more, whatever it is, than you feel comfortable with. And a lot of students will try to kind of conform to that, even though they don't really want to, because they think that's the way to be a high school student in this high school, or a college student in this college, or a fraternity member in this frat, or whatever it is. People use their perceptions of peer norms as a standard against which to compare their own behaviors. Okay. So norms of drinking and smoking, norms of hand washing and mask wearing today during the pandemic. People's norms of what people like me are doing. If everyone else is washing their hands, though everyone else is wearing their mask or not, that's going to matter to a lot of people. And there's also been some really cool social psychological research on norms and environmental behaviors. For example, getting people to use to recycle their towels in a hotel room, for example, or to use less energy, things like that. What you think your peers are doing matters a lot. And there's some really cool research, which I don't have time to get into, to talk about that kind of thing. And finally, norms and social justice. I think as we've been dealing with, in the last few weeks since George Floyd's murder, the norms about Black Lives Matter, about social justice, have really shifted a lot in the general population right now in the country. And I think that's as horrific as these incidents have been, and as horrible as systemic racism is, and depressing and all of that, the thing that gives me a little bit of optimism is that norms are changing about the acceptability of these kind of things. And that's something we can talk about during the Q&A. So let me stop there. Let me stop sharing my screen so we could open up and see some people, and open it up to questions. And Courtney, maybe you can help me in terms of any questions that come over in the chat. Also, feel free to raise your hand virtually if that's an option, so I can see that and we can maybe call on some people. So I'll stop there.
Yeah, so we have one question so far from Jack, asking about the intersection of psychology and sociology. And the question is, how often do those two topics intersect for you?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a long history of sociology and social psychology intersecting. There's often a branch within sociology called social psychology, and there's a branch within psychology called social psych, and there's a lot of overlay between those two things. Sociology tends to emphasize more group level phenomena. They don't do as many experiments as we do in psychology. Social psychology in a psychology department is more experimental usually. It's more about looking at individuals within a group context as opposed to large masses of individuals demographically, for example. Like sociologists might study, a demographic group or people of a certain socioeconomic class and how that changes over time. Whereas social psychologists will look at a particular individual and see how that context affects the individual behavior. So, but yeah, there's a lot of intersection between the two. Great question. So I see from Ash, going back to the ideas from the Reagan debate, do you know if anything similar has been done with other types of performance like stand-up comedy or dramatic theater? So the results similar. There's not a lot of experiments on that kind of thing, but there's certainly some. The idea of like a laugh track, which is becoming a little bit more out of fashion these days. But, a lot of comedy shows on TV, for example, has the sound of laughter, right? And most of the time it's actually artificial. There's some real live studio reaction, but if it's not a funny comedy, they just pipe in what sounds like real laughter. And a lot of times you kind of know this sounds fake. No one will be laughing that hard. And yet research shows it actually works. Even when you know, oh, come on, this is ridiculous, it still makes it seem funnier. It's like, okay, here's a joke because they're laughing, and it makes it seem funnier usually. So that kind of thing does actually work. How did you manage the role political views could have played in the Reagan-Mondale study? Great question. Basically, in any kind of good experiment, you randomly assign people to conditions. But with random assignment, so everyone's an equal chance of being in any condition. What that means is there should be just as many people who are Republicans in one condition as the other, just as many people who are tall in one condition as the other, just as many people with dark hair as in the other condition. Everything should equal out by random chance, so that any differences there are in political views balances out. So you have just as many people who should have been Reagan fans in one condition as the other. And our effects overcome that is basically the point. Do students at Williams have opportunity for research in psychology? Great, I'm glad you asked that. Absolutely. The study I talked about, the Reagan-Mondo study, my collaborators on that were some other faculty, but also students who worked on it as a senior thesis or as a paid research assistant, or as what we call an independent study, where you get course credit for being part of the project. And it's like and throughout Williams, we really emphasize students getting involved in research who want to do that. And psychology in particular, that's a big part of our culture. Just by the courses you take, once you take your first intro level courses, eventually you take courses where you actually do studies together. You design studies, and that's part of what you do as a curriculum, which is a lot of fun. That's how I first got interested in psychology. I came to college not wanting to be a psych major. I didn't know anything about psychology. I was going to major in English, but I took a psychology class. I helped design a study as part of it, and I just fell in love with that whole process. So there's tons of research experience opportunities at Williams in general and psychology in particular. Other questions? Let's see.
I just want to pop in really quickly and remind you all that we've got about 3 minutes left, and I want to make sure that all the students can get to the next session on time, so we can take about 2 more questions. What do you think, Steve?
Okay, sure. Let's see. Since George Floyd's murder, I will admit the social norms are changing about Black Lives Matter among certain groups, but it is clear that the BLM movement is causing other groups to dig even deeper into their prejudice. Absolutely. Do you think this dichotomy will be resolved anytime soon? How do we change influence social norms among inherently prejudiced groups? That's a really difficult question to answer in the 2 minutes I have remaining. I teach an entire course, a 300 level, what we call an upper level course, usually for juniors and seniors, on stereotyping, prejudice, discrimination. We tackle these kind of issues for an entire semester. And even that isn't enough time to really get into everything. Yeah, we're a very polarized country, more so than ever in my experience. So people are going to dig into their own divisions a lot of times. To me, like the fact that NASCAR is sort of, now distancing themselves and trying to remove the Confederate flag from their races, the fact that the Washington football franchise is now, after the owner said it will never change the name Redskins. I don't care what anybody says. It's a good name. We're keeping it. And now they're not. So even when people are very entrenched, you're starting to see some change. And I think as your generation, hopefully with more progressive attitudes and older generations become more powerful as you age and have become business leaders and government leaders and things like that, and vote, hopefully, I think that we'll start to see more of a shift. But it's not going to be fast to get people who are very entrenched on the other side of that divide to change their attitudes, because it's about their own identity, their own group norms that are validated with each other. But as they see the shift, like for example, attitudes towards same-sex marriage, within 10 years, there's a complete flip from the majority of Americans being opposed to it. Within 10 years, a majority of Americans being in favor of it. I never would have guessed that could happen that rapidly. It seemed just as entrenched as some of these issues we're talking about now with the Black Lives Matter movement. So it can happen when the right leaders are in place, and when the people are mobilized. I think change can happen. There's the Martin Luther King quote of the arc of the moral universe of the universe bends toward justice, but it bends slowly. And I think that's where we're heading.